Now that we understand how a computer encodes data, it's time to learn how to do it in JavaScript, the programming language that we're going to use in this course. And we'll notice that I've added a JavaScript file to my project. It's called app.js. The .js, of course, stands for JavaScript. And the way that we add our JavaScript file to our index.html page is very similar to how we did it in Bootstrap, where we added it to our body element. But in this case, instead of being an HTTP path, or an HTTP URL rather, it's just going to be a relative path to wherever the file is located in our file structure. And with this app.js file now included as a script in our index.html file, we can begin writing JavaScript in our app.js file. And we're going to begin with one of the most fundamental aspects of JavaScript, which are variables. We can gain an intuition for variables in programming by relating them to something we're already familiar with, like variables in math. If you think back to your days in algebra, you might remember learning about things like x and y variables. The power that we learned of x and y variables and other variables like it was that it allowed us to generalize equations. For instance, one equation we learned about was the equation of a line, y equals mx plus b. And this equation, y equals mx plus b, allows us to do something really cool. It allows us to take certain inputs, which are the slope of the line, the current horizontal point of the line, and the starting vertical point of the line, and figure out, based solely on this current horizontal point of the line, what the current vertical point of the line is. And so what this does, in essence, is allow us to generalize the equation of a line. So we can take any inputs at all, any slope, any current x point, and any starting vertical point, and figure out what the current vertical point is. And this principle applies to programming because, in essence, what we're going to do in JavaScript is create some different variables to store things like user input or data that we collect from somewhere else on the web or whatever, and output some functionality or some feature, some behavior, some solution, or some answer or whatever to the client. And so in essence, we're just creating equations like this using variables and performing some operations on them. But what's nice is that instead of using single letter variables, we're going to name our variables things that make a lot more sense. And so let's take a look at exactly how we create these variables in JavaScript. And this is how we create a variable in JavaScript. Let's walk through this line step by step. The first thing that we'll notice is this keyword called var. A keyword in JavaScript is a special word that the JavaScript programming language itself understands to mean a particular thing. And in this case, the var keyword simply means that we want to declare a variable. And when I say we want to declare a variable, what happens is that under the hood, our computer finds some bits that aren't currently being used by any other program, which JavaScript, which our program, can use to encode whatever data we assign to this variable. Now, as you might have guessed, the next word is the name of the variable. We can name this any number of things, but in this case, I decided to name it my name. And we want to pay attention to what's called the Camelcase notation here. We start with a lowercase word, but then we separate kind of individual English words by denoting them with an uppercase letter. We can't have any spaces in our variable names, so instead we use Camelcase notation. Next, we have this equal sign, but in JavaScript, this equal sign doesn't mean equal to, it means assignment. And so what we're doing here is assigning this data, this value, to this variable. And in essence, that means that we're encoding this data into whatever bits this variable has set aside for it in our computer. And this entire line here creates what's called a statement. So this assignment, this declaration and assignment, is what's called a statement. And in JavaScript, we end our statements with a semicolon. It's kind of similar to how in English, when we write a sentence, we end a sentence with a period or an exclamation or question mark or whatever. In JavaScript, instead of that punctuation, we use the punctuation of a semicolon. Now, one other important thing to note here is that when we declare and assign a variable at the same time in the same statement, this is what's called initialization. And so here, we're actually initializing, because it's the very first assignment of data into this variable, we're initializing this myName variable. And we can do something pretty cool, which is that we can print out, or we can rather log to the console, whatever's in the myName variable. And I'll show exactly what this means by going over to our browser and inspecting some of our developer tools. So in our browser, if we right-click on our web page and select Inspect, it'll pop up our developer tools, which we should already be familiar with from previous lessons where we talked about the HTML and the CSS styling tools. But over here, we'll notice another tool in our navigation pane called the console. And if we click on that, now we can see that it printed out the word Zach. And we can see exactly which line of our JavaScript file caused this to be printed out by looking over here and seeing the app.js:4. That :4 indicates that it was the fourth line of our app.js file. So that's pretty cool. And printing out data from our application is going to become extremely useful later on when we write more complex applications and want to figure out what exactly is the value of a variable that I'm dealing with, so that we're confident that it's making the right computations in our program.